Okay, well, welcome everybody. I will be having more folks coming in throughout the presentations, but again, I'm Jay Arena with the International Luxembourg Network, who is hosting this series, the teach-in series on socialism and the world crisis. And this is the first presentation in a 3 to 4 part series that we will be holding. And so we want to stay in contact with everyone. I assume everyone that's registered for this, we do have your email. So we want to continue this. This is not just a talk shop. We want to be able to talk about Luxembourg's theories in the face of the crisis and how we can actually apply them to build a movement. So for this presentation, the title is What is State-Financed Capitalism? And we have 4 presenters today. Some of them, they've introduced themselves, but I'll give them a little bit more background. We have, the first speaker will be Peter Hudis. He is a professor of philosophy at Oakton Community College, and he's co-editor of the Rosa Luxemburg Reader. And as he mentioned, he'll be coming out with the full works of Rosa Luxemburg, which we'll all be looking forward to. Then we have Sally Mew, who's joining us from Ho Chi Minh City. And she is an associate professor at the Marxist Institute of Ho Chi Minh City. And so she'll be presenting second. Each speaker will have 15 minutes. Our third presenter is Eric Van de Venner. As he mentioned, he's a graduate of the sociology program, PhD at NYU. And he's the author of The Strong Dollar and the Political Economy of Financialization. And then finally, we have Eric Lerner with the International Luxembourgist Network and the author of For a Worker's Recovery. So we're going to have, each speaker will be allotted up to 15 minutes. I'll give you an indicator when you're getting close to your time. And then after the speakers have presented, we're going to open it up to the audience, and we're asking people to keep it to 2 minutes. Your question from the, I mean, it can be less, but no more than 2 minutes, so we can have the most amount of participation and exchange. And if you're uncomfortable with verbalizing, speaking your question, you could put it in the chat box, and I'll present it to one of the speakers. And again, we want to stay in contact with everyone. This is being, as you know, it is being video. There's a video copy of the presentations, and we're hoping to get this out to more people that are not able to attend this. Okay, so with that, let me hand it over to our first presenter, Peter Hudis.
Well, thank you very much, Jay and Eric, for making this event possible, and thank you all for being here. The call for this conference states correctly, I believe, the following. I'll quote it directly. For the first time in history, in all the industrialized countries, from China to Europe, Japan, and the United States, the state has become the main source of capital investment. Instead of capitalists lending capital at interest to the state, now the state lends to the capitalists at no interest, end quote. I think what this statement tells us is that we're living in an era of state capitalism, in which the state assumes an increasingly important role in the economy and in social life. Now, as I see it, the era of state capitalism is not new. It first emerged during the Great Depression of the 1930s, when the state was embraced as a spur to capital accumulation worldwide and in different manifestations, from Stalin's 5-year plans in the Soviet Union, Hitler's 4-year plans in Germany, to FDR's New Deal. However, even many who acknowledge that state capitalism defined the global economy from the 1930s right through the 1970s, many of them assume that it ended with the rise of neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s. But neoliberalism, which I think was never a particularly coherent term to begin with, means a lot of things to a lot of different people, did not represent an end to the state's central role in the economy. It only repurposed the state's role, as I see it, in a new direction. Instead of using the state to pump up effective demand through a massive welfare state, or in order to guide part of guiding industrial policy, today's state capitalism pumps up effective demand by putting cash directly in the hands of capital at the expense of labor, while using the state to ensure the stability of the financial sector. Now, the reason for this is not hard to see. From the mid-1970s onward, global capitalism has suffered from an endemic decline in the rate of profit, despite occasional ups and downs, especially in manufacturing. Now, since capital migrates to areas where profit rates are higher, it naturally becomes increasingly financialized. This is a result of capital's crisis of profitability, I would argue, not its cause. It's the result, not its cause. And since the flight to speculative and fictitious capital is built on extremely unstable foundations, the state steps in and serves to prop that financial sector up through debt financing, through all sorts of things like quantitative easing, through taxation policy, going to the bond markets, et cetera, all kinds of other gimmicks in order to strengthen and hold up this financial sector. Now, two important consequences flow from this. First, those who have fixated on neoliberalism for the last 30 years tend to fail to grasp this increased role of the state, since they proceed from the naive assumption that after the 1970s, the state withdrew from direct intervention in the economy in favor of the untrammeled free market. It's short-sightedness, I think, to view matters this way, and that short-sightedness is a consequence of focusing on the contingent forms of appearance of capital on the market to the exclusion of grasping the logic of capital as disclosed by its essential underlying relations of production. Many, including on the left, have a difficult time accounting for the depths of the state's role in the economy because they have a superficial critique of capitalism that reduces it or equates it simply to unregulated markets and private ownership of property, instead of locating its contradictions, as did Marx, in the alienated form of human relations that makes unregulated markets and private ownership of the means of production possible in the first place. Second consequence that flows from this. A superficial understanding and critique of capitalism inevitably leads to a superficial and inadequate understanding of socialism. That's why I think Marx spent 30 years writing Capital. It wasn't because he wasn't interested in getting to an understanding of socialism. It was because that's the way you get to an understanding of socialism. Too many, however, including among the new generation of activists drawn to Marxism, which is certainly an exciting and welcome development, conceives of socialism as little more than an enhanced or radicalized welfare state, even though it should be obvious, given the history of the past 100 years, that the welfare state is completely compatible with the continuance of capitalism. So why do so many continue to discuss socialism in a completely unproblematic way, as if everyone knows and agrees on what it means, as if the only issue that divides us are strategic ones, like how to get to socialism? Should we have electoral politics or insurrectionism, reform or revolution, etc.? This, despite the century-long failure of Stalinist and social democratic regimes, both in the West and in the global South, to avoid falling into the clutches of state capitalism. The reason, I think, is that so many continue to discuss socialism in a completely unproblematic way is that it's easier to critique free markets and private ownership than envisioning a socialist future that is freed from alienated labor, from value production, which means production for the sake of augmenting wealth in monetary terms, and freed from forms of human relations that take the form of relations between things, especially when it comes to issues of racism and sexism. The truth is that there's no consensus today as to what socialism really means. Instead, the question rarely even comes up, often even among its most avid proponents. But socialism is not an unproblematic concept. Its meaning for today has to be rethought from the bottom up. And to me, this is the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg and how she lives for today, even though I think in some respects, she had a problematic view of socialism in the sense that she tended to view market anarchy versus planned production as the pivot of the difference of capitalism and socialism, though her overall emancipatory vision went way, way, way beyond that kind of framework. But the point is, her famous phrase, socialism or barbarism is a wonderful phrase to continuously remind ourselves of and propagate, but we should never forget that for much of the last 100 years, many so-called socialist efforts to create socialism, and many states calling themselves in one way or another socialist, have been forms of barbarism. So we have to proceed on a much deeper level that even she proceeded from, theoretically, in terms of what is an adequate conception of a viable alternative to capitalism. I think we can begin the work on doing that by putting to bed the stubborn refusal to acknowledge that state capitalism is not, put to bed the stubborn refusal to acknowledge that state capitalism actually isn't a path to socialism. Now, I think this is most strikingly evident in the problem that many have in seeing further than calling for a fair redistribution of surplus value and profit. It goes without saying that we desperately need such redistribution. I'm all in favor of it, right? I would give my right arm for single payer healthcare insurance, literally, okay, in this country. The level of economic inequality today is so extensive, it's literally choking us and the environment to death. But the challenge is to promote forms of redistribution that point to an exit from capitalism, not ones that make it possible for the system to obtain a new lease on life. And any call for redistribution of surplus value that does not call into question the very existence of value in the first place. After all, you can't redistribute what doesn't exist, right? But if you call for redistribution of value, you're assuming the permanence of value production, which in other words means the permanence of alienated labor and human relations that take the form of relations between things. So any kind of call for redistribution that does not call into question the existence of alienated labor, value production, etc., does indeed provide a loophole for the system to obtain a new lease on life. Now, in my view, a very different and much more radical kind of call for redistribution has gained public attention in recent years. And it's one that I think points us in exactly the right direction. The demand to defund and abolish police, prisons, and the entire criminal justice injustice system, and redirect those resources instead to human needs. I'm actually active with the campaign to defund Chicago police and here in Chicago, and we have a heavy battle to wage in terms of this struggle, as you can probably all imagine from your own involvement or your own things that are happening in your area, where the winds, of course, politically in America right now are blowing in a very, very different direction. But all the more reason to stake out a position in defense of these demands, which I think are of pivotal importance. And why is that? It's because this demands to defund and abolish police, prison, the criminal justice system, etc., while completely compatible with calls to strengthen the welfare state in the short term, right? I mean, there's nothing that's absolutely important for us to strengthen the state of the welfare state to the extent that it be done in the short term and oppose attacks upon it. But while demands for abolishing the criminal injustice system are compatible with calls to strengthen the welfare state in the short term, they also go much further in positing a pathway to transcend capitalism in the long term. And there's a rich literature, of course, that exists about this, and a rich debate occurring within the movement today in America about this and elsewhere. After all, it's not possible to maintain capitalist property, class, and racial relations without police and without prisons. So my conclusion is that neither return to the social democracy of the Second International, now, or some new variant of Maoist or other forms of leftist authoritarian voluntarism are going to take us where we need to go. There is a resurgence of interest in the Second International, and especially the Kautsky-Luxembourg debate, not only the one from 1910, but also the one in 1918, which volume 5 of the complete works of Rosa Luxemburg, that's going to be another 600-page volume we're working on, should be out within another year or two. Verso is publishing one a year, so it's a little slow, but we hope to speed it up at some point. But the point is, there's a resurgence of interest, not so much in the reformism of Bernstein or whatnot, but in what's increasingly being termed revolutionary social democracy. And of course, social democracy for Luxemburg's generation, as she understood it, was of course revolutionary. The question is, as far as I can see, neither return to social democracy of the Second International, nor the variants of the more radical variants that opposed it, but did not go further in terms of rethinking the concept of socialism that's adequate for our time, is where we need to go. We need a new unifying principle that is truly based on Marxist humanism, which centers on the transformation of those human relations that take on the form of relations between things. We need that unifying principle as what can truly alter our thought and experience. And the path to work out that kind of principle for today's movement is a very difficult and a very fraught one. But I think discussions like we're having today in this roundtable and other discussions that will be part of this conference's proceedings in the coming weeks really provides an excellent, wonderful opportunity to get into this on a deeper level. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Sally Mew.
Yeah, hold on. Hi, everyone. I'm Sally from Vietnam and I'm 22. I am still a student of Economic University, but at the same time, I am an associate professor in Tom Hang University. And it's really hard for me to work on Rosa Luxemburg here, since everyone here is against her. This is the first time I got a chance to reason something about her. So this year celebrate Rosa Luxemburg 150th birthday. I hope the discussion will be a great contribution to international workers and celebrate Rosa Luxemburg birthday too. So because the topic for today are too big for me, I may make some mistakes and my knowledge is limited. So I still want to try to be criticized. And I will use many Marxist theories for every concept. And today I start from the basic, but from the definitions. I hope everyone can understand and give me your opinion if I'm wrong. And since English is not my first language, so forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the word. So moreover, I only have a very short time, so I cannot cover all of the specifics. So you can ask about it later or write me an email. And today I will reason about what is state capitalism, what is state-financed capitalism, what are the differences between two leading powerful countries, China and the US? How was the situation before and after the pandemic? And what does it mean for our class struggle today? First, I think to understand state-financed capitalism, I think it is very necessary to define what state capitalism is. You know, Rosa Luxemburg in 1918 words against turning the centralizations in the organization of the party into the way of organizing a revolutionary government. Similarly, because its consequences will lead to dictatorships, destroying democracy, which is the basic vitality of the communists. And this was absolutely true when Stalin came to power not long after and started a period of authority powered by the state. Although Rosa talked a lot about the relation between capitalism and the state, however, at this time, she still did not have a completely clear concept of state capitalism like Dunayevskaya later. And the capitalism survived through the accumulation, profit accumulation and exploitation. Later, Raya Dunayevskaya developed the theory of state capitalism in 1941 after seeing the dictatorship of Stalinism, and she was opposing Trotsky when he argues that the Soviet Union was a worker state. You know, in her work, she argues that workers are still being treated and fair and paid unfairly, and that the government accumulates capital for another purpose and always protects the profits of industrial capital. So the state capitalism is the concentration of power in a party or a government. They run and compromise with capitalists to develop the economy. So now we can come to what is state-financed capitalism. You know that accumulation played a huge role in wealthy development of capitalism. They exploit the workers and took on the surplus value and accumulate them for their private capital purposes. Rosa Luxemburg, you know, she's not only a Marxist and politician, she also a neo-Marxian economist, a genius woman who continued to write Marx Capital and review his work objectively. Then for the accumulation process rose that the other aspect of the accumulation of capital concerned the relation between capitalism and the non-capitalist mode of production, which start making their appearance on the international stage is predominant method of colonial policies and international law system, policy of sphere of interest and war. So please pay attention to the international stages because this will be a very important one to help us understand state finance capitalism. And today we have big chaos come from neoliberalism promoting by Friedman or Hayek, or in other words, it is international state finance capitalism. It was initially practiced in developed countries in cooperation with the state power for survival and was later expanded to other countries like in Asia and in Africa. Now we can see that without the state, the finance capitalism or the neoliberalism cannot exist, and that the state acts as the representative of international finance capitalism. And together, they exploit us and the ecosystem for the recent economic growth. So, in reality, political power is nothing but a vehicle for the economic process. That is what Rosa say. The state play an important role in managing the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and developing a system of thoughts based on capital accumulation and related interests. And international stages, as mentioned by Rosa, what is the driving force and promoting the expansion of state capitalism today are international organizations such as the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. Now I think it's time to talk about powerful countries which lead in this economic model and to give us a clear understanding of today's crisis as well as the huge influence of state finance capitalism by two leading countries, China and the US, I think it is worth mentioning Samir Amin, a political economic Marxist who has a lot of praise for the works of Rosa Luxemburg. Samir Amin was a very great man who passed away in 2018, but I don't know if he was still alive. What would he say about the COVID pandemic today? Amin argues that China has nothing to do with socialism. They are the reorganizations that replace capital and enlist the raw power that are likely to be collected in imperialism. The difference in state finance capitalism between China and the US, as described by Samir Amin, is that neoliberalism came to the US in around 1980s, and China rejected it, but then adopted it and strictly controlled this system. So that's why in 2008, China did not suffer from the financial crisis. And the another difference for today, which I think is the Chinese government takes over all power and is more authoritarian. They take over the entire market economy. Right now there is a movement where they go into take all of the properties of the wealthy and accumulate for themselves. So but it's a little bit different in America. I think where you are free to criticize the government, that's a different story. Because in China or even in my country, we can even do anything like criticize the government, or we can do anything about writing about Marx or even Rosa Luxemburg. So one similarity between China and the US is that the working class has no way out. They have to work day and night, working many jobs to earn a living. So what about today and today, before and after the pandemic? Well, there's not much of a difference. I think state finance capitalism take advantage of natural disaster such as earthquake, flood for profit. And while people are still shocked by what had just happened, the government introduced capitalism policy to stress them and oppress people once again. So it's the same situation to the COVID pandemic today, when the government consolidate power with coercive policies. Here, yes, I know there are many stories and controversy about the mask that you are wearing on the COVID times, but here Wearing a mask is good thing to avoid the COVID, to avoid the pandemic. But the capitalist government here, they take advantage of the fear of the people and the mask to declare hegemony and political purpose. And it's another matter, like they control people by a mask. People, if people like listening to them later, they will listen to everything that the government demands. So someone asked me that America is a failed state. So how should people fight? Well, I don't know. I'm in Vietnam, but I think that in general, what does the struggle of the working class mean today? This is a very huge question. I would say workers are not the weak, and to improve on the next step, we can always watch what will happen as support the worker strike. I think it is simple in the US where workers are free to strike, but in Asian country, it is much more restricted. However, I know that in America, when you go on a big strike, the government and the police will suppress you or oppress you. Like there are many anti-police movement there, and I can see that on the news and on everything. So yeah, we can deny that the strike is indeed a good thing to strengthen the ideology of the working class. As Rosa suggested, the work can mature through strike, in a mass strike. So one more thing that I could count on now is education. And I believe that it will have our last struggle today when the workers start questioning the exploitation around them and resolving class conflicts, as well as having the solidarity of international workers. The workers now have many conflicts and they cannot unite because of the gender conflicts or the LGBT conflicts, and they are our task to solve all of them, to have them to unite. Yeah, so that's all about my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Okay, yeah, okay, so we slept to that. Thank you, Sally. And our next presenter is Eric Van de Vent.
Hi. So I'm Eric Van de Venter. The Strong Dollar and the Political Economy of Financialization is my doctoral thesis, which is not published yet, so you can't buy it. But what it looks at is specifically about the US economy, but as part of the world economy, the connections between these things. And this is because most of the research that is done on the topic of financialization is rooted in the US economy, and that is to its detriment. And also it completely ignores things like Luxemburg's work and value theory, which I wanted to actually discuss and include. So topics such as financialization, the increasing share of the profits in the US economy that are going to the financial sector, insurance, real estate, rent, and so forth. The issue of neoliberalism, the quoted rise in power of the capitalist class, and seemingly a transformation of our economic activities towards kinds of rent-seeking and rentier capitalists, capitalists who are trying to make super profits, excess profits, without necessarily producing things that contribute to economic well-being for most of us. And the transformation of the capitalists and the upper middle classes even towards trying to get wealth through capital gains and playing in the property markets and the stock markets, essentially taking not so much the value of production, but a fictitious value that is created by the acceleration and inflation of asset prices, which is largely boosted by state policy. So I wanted to look back at the roots of the state policy and how it came to be that an economy such as the US should turn so sharply away from growth through manufacturing and employment to something like this financialization that we've seen. And there's a trade-off here, right, between the development of the manufacturing industries and finance. And we've seen increasingly that finance has, and other non-manufacturing or non-quote productive sectors have seen the benefit of this. In fact, in many cases, there's been disinvestment by the productive sectors. So manufacturing has deindustrialized to a great extent, but some of these firms will actually take not only all of their operating surplus and hand that over to shareholders in the form of stock buybacks, but they'll take more than that. So they'll effectively hollow out and disinvest from their manufacturing industries. So I wanted to look at how this may have happened and what the state's role in it was. And so I'll provide a little bit of historical background there with my time. So during the 70s, the US was working with certainly the largest and one of the more advanced industrial sort of bases of the world economy, very large, coming out of World War II and the investments that happened after that. But it was getting old, and more advanced industries were being built in places like Japan and in Western Europe. And the US was seeing a falling rate of profit, these capitalist firms, and were given a choice between a new round, a massive round of investment to replace and overtake the existing kind of industrial base of US society, or to do something different. And at the end of the 70s, they sort of collectively made a decision not to make those investments, but instead to look for other opportunities. Now, what we've seen since then is that those opportunities were found in financial investments and globalization and international kinds of investment. But it wasn't obvious at the outset that this would be possible because the returns on financial investments at the end of the 70s were quite low. Inflation was very high, almost up to the rate of interest. So financial sector was not doing very well. And the result of that was that the US was actually experiencing, or on the verge of at least, capital flight. So the US was not consistently getting inflows of capital from the rest of the world, and the value of the dollar was deteriorating. So the capitalists, during the Carter administration, you may have heard of the Volcker shock, the actions taken by the Federal Reserve, actions taken at the outset of the Reagan administration, and so forth, worked to correct from the capitalist perspective, inadequate returns to financial investments and the financial sector. And they did this in a very concerted way, and in a way that isn't really recognized in mainstream research, but it's very clear if you look at the documents that that is what they were after. My specific research had to do with the strong dollar. So the value of the dollar has a lot to do with the interest rates that the US private sector experiences, and as well as the flows of capital between the US and the rest of the world. The US, since 1980, has consistently had a trade deficit, and that means capital has also flowed into the US economy, essentially taking surplus from whatever other countries and bringing it into the US financial sector, which gives the US financial sector a larger and larger share of the world's value to manage and turnover and speculate with, used to drive up property values and so forth. To do this, the US had, in the 80s, an extraordinarily strong dollar, which means the dollar was worth a huge amount relative to the other major currencies of the world, the yen, the pound, the mark, and so forth. And that was to the detriment of industry, because the US industry was an export, in part at least, an exporting industry that was producing things for the rest of the world, exporting capital in the physical sense, meaningful means of production were going to the rest of the world. And that has been decreasingly the case ever since, because of a very sharp recession that happened early in the 1980s that really had a huge wave of deindustrialization that took over in the US economy. And the manufacturers simply couldn't export over the high value of the dollar. The US goods were too expensive relative to other countries' goods for them to successfully compete. And this created opportunities for a few other countries to do some of the material investment that would have happened had the US capitalists been interested in doing that. What the US capitalists were more interested in doing, rather than continuing with their investment in manufacturing, although of course they do to an extent, there was a little revival toward the 90s, but with those caveats, they were more interested in becoming either multinationals who would purchase assets in other countries, purchase firms, productive resources in other countries that would have higher rate of profit than what they foresaw from continued investment in the US, or to turn that money over to stockholders, or in other ways get into financial speculation and make their profits that way. In a financial market where there is a lot of capital flowing in, where the value of the currency is strong and stable, where many firms are turning over their profits and many households are turning over their savings to purchase assets like houses and so forth, the value of those assets will go up and up and up. And you sort of have a bubble, which can create a higher rate of return based on this demand for the financial assets, which is creating higher values of these assets. That is fictitious capital. It's not an actual surplus. It's not actual wealth that has been created in the world economy. You know, if the price of Tesla stock or Amazon stock goes up to however many hundreds of dollars, and someone that has a book value of their assets, the owner, say Musk or something, of $200 billion, it's not as if $200 billion of wealth has actually landed in his pocket. It's that the assets, which are in the form of stocks, which cannot necessarily be sold, right, add up to that amount. But what this does do is create huge amounts of assets, which banks can then use, again, to create loans and turnover and further accelerate this, inflation of asset prices. And that's what we've seen. We've seen housing and the stock market and all sorts of financial activities create huge bodies of wealth, right, for the capitalists who hold those resources. And since the 80s, the state has gotten involved in making sure this can continue to happen. And I'm speaking here of the US state, but of course it's also true of the other major states of the major financial players. My specific research was that the state has continuously kept the dollar high with a couple things we could talk about, but to the greatest extent of its capability, actions by the Treasury Department. But there's also been the more familiar things like the bailouts of various banks, and later on the cash injections, quantitative easing, and so forth. So in essence, what the US state has done is committed to this kind of political economy of investment concentrated in purely financial areas, and not investment in sort of the normal Marxist sense of development of means of production, but simply money that has been created through lending and banking and loans and so forth, with this snowball effect, right? It's not just, however, that the financial sector has concentrated on these things, but whole areas of the US economy have been geared towards this kind of setup. We have deindustrialization, reduction of the manufacturing sectors, but we have a service economy that is actually much larger. It's larger than it was in the past, certainly, but it's much larger as a share of the overall economy. And in places like New York or San Francisco, the major cities, these services are largely geared to keeping workers and middle classes and even capitalists happy with their kinds of whatever they're doing while they're making profits in the financial sector. And the incomes, moreover, of the middle classes in the United States, their expectations of retirement and so forth, are based on the expectation that this system will continue. This very system and what the US government is doing will continue to accelerate the prices and maintain demand for houses at their extraordinarily high prices, maintain values of stocks and demand for those stocks and so forth. So it will be very difficult for those middle classes or for those capitalists to accept any kind of conversion of the US economy away from these things. And certainly the capitalists in the US are not interested in making large tangible investments in the US economy or really in other places. Now, the US capitalists certainly send some of their surplus abroad in the form of FDI, foreign direct investment, which does occasionally lead to new factories and new production and so forth. But mostly it buys assets in other countries, already developed, things that the US corporations can then take a profit on. Why do they seek to do this? It seems that the rate of return on taking production in a low wage country and then moving the goods produced to higher wage or higher profit parts of the world creates an opportunity for markups, essentially. This is the work of William Milberg at the New School on outsourcing economics. Also, I'd recommend the work of John Smith, Imperialism in the 21st Century, where the capitalists can find large sources of profit through exploiting the differences in wages and in effect exploiting the capitalist investment of other countries, because it's not the US firms that make these investments that develop production of goods in China or many other countries, but it is capital or surpluses that have been accumulated in those countries, which themselves build up to allow capitalists in those countries to produce things, which then become parts of value chains and surpluses that go back to the United States or to other developed countries. There's analogies to be made with Europe and with Japan and so on and so forth. So most of the, not to say that most of the economic activity in the US is to do with imported goods or with financial services or other things. A lot of it is the service economy. A lot of it is relatively low productivity, low profit enterprises. Some of them are small businesses and so forth. But the sources of the greatest profit, the most lucrative opportunity for capitalists are to be found in these integrations of the world economy and situations where the US doesn't develop and doesn't invest in a higher level of productive output, but instead relies on financial asset price inflation and so forth to make these great profits. So let's see, how much time do I have, Jay?
You're doing fine, about 4 minutes or so.
Okay. Sorry. So we should look forward to what the consequences of this might be. To refer a little bit to the sort of the theme of the talks today, the state is an organizer of a huge volume of investment from the capitalist standpoint, which is to say money and loans which go to financial markets and participate in this run-up of asset prices. But in the US at least, it is not, generally speaking, at the source of actual investments that are happening in the economy. And it's unclear what would happen if it did try to have, just from an economic standpoint, investments in the economy. Could the US economy actually produce a lot more of anything if a lot of money was put into it? We've seen that when demand has changed in the past year due to the COVID circumstances and the recession, supply chains have been unable to adapt and provide goods that would be used simply by consumer demand, let alone a new round of investment. The US now lacks most of the industrial capacity, such as production of steel and other things, to greatly expand its productive economy as it did after World War II. And that's not entirely a bad thing, because if the US did greatly expand its industrial output and used a lot more energy, that would only further accelerate the climate catastrophe that we are facing. So in addition to that, we might say that there are certain kinds of investment that the US economy ought to be doing, regardless of those issues, specifically, let's say, cleaner energy and things that need to be done to maintain the infrastructure that we have, to try to reduce our carbon footprint and so forth. I think these will be resisted very sharply by the Democrats and the Republicans, the powers of the US government, because they want to see the current political economy continue. They want to see a political economy based on the strength of finance and these capital gains and fictitious capital continue to be the center of the US economy. And they'll run right off the cliff, right? They do not seem to be concerned about what will happen in 20 years. Many of the people who support these policies will, fortunately or not be around in 20 years. And if regardless of what the case is, the capitalists do not have the flexibility to change their form of investment, to change to a new political economy that will not destroy the environment, that will actually, improve the material conditions that we live in, improve our society through useful work, which is not really being done. The work that's being done in the US, to the extent it seems to be useful in developing the country, like building new 4-lane roads in states with 2 senators and 1 representative, and people remodeling perfectly good kitchens so that their house can be worth, $100,000 more when they sell it. Needless work. So the work that seems to be productive that's done in the US economy is in fact destructive, and itself is not investment. It is negative investment in a sense, in the way that it destroys the future conditions that we will live in you know, it would be better if it weren't done at all. So one last point I'd make is that a lot of people see the Green New Deal as the solution to some of these problems, that there will be you know, better funding of the service economy, which generally I would support, and that there will be infrastructure investment and so forth. This will be blocked by a supermajority of the legislature and the presidents and the administrative agencies and the Supreme Court and everything else in the US. It can be foreseen, even if the Social Democrats, which is how I categorize the squad and sort of the left wing of the Democratic Party, somehow were to gain their own own supermajority to try to enact some of this legislation, and they somehow got past the Supreme Court and other things like that, then they would face a capital strike. They would face capital flight from the US. They would face capitalists not cooperating. They would face an economic recession, surely, which we'll see anyway, but one that would be brought on and blamed upon them. They'll be thrown out of office. You know, we can talk on other meetings probably about what steps to take, but these kinds of things can't happen without a much more fundamental transformation of the economic system. And at the very minimum, we have to say that there have to be mass actions that will push capitalists to not immediately stop any good thing that will be happening. And I would include mass strikes and things of that nature in that strategy. So I'll stop there, and thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. And we look forward to the book coming out of that dissertation. Great stuff. And I know there'll be some questions. So our last presenter for this presentation is Eric Lerner.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jay, and thanks for the other presentation. I just want to be sure that everyone can see my presentation. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I too will be talking about what is state-financed capitalism. Basically, excuse me. We have arrived at a critical point in the history of the human race. Humanity is in crisis because capitalist expanded reproduction, as Marx defines it, has come to an end. We've gone from the growing stagnation of the last half century and have entered an actual period of global contraction, similar to the period of the two world wars and the Depression, but with really no capitalist exit possible. Easiest way to see this evolution, I think, is in the simple graph. The blue line shows the rate of mortality decline globally. In other words, the higher that, the faster the rate of mortality is declining, the faster the increase in the standard of living. And we see the pattern that this peaked in the 1960s, where the standard of living was rising very rapidly and immediately started declining into a period of near stagnation by the end of the century. There was a blip in the first decades of the 21st century as China was integrated into the world economy. And now, starting with the crash of 2008, and then greatly accelerating with the pandemic, we have moved into a period of a decline in standards of living and an increase in the mortality rate. In the past 2 years, global mortality rate has been increasing at a rate of 10% per year, very significantly. If we look at the scale of production, we have a very similar story. The rate of energy increase, corrected for the population, again peaked in the 50s and the 60s, and in the 70s started to decline sharply into a long period of near stagnation. Again, there was a blip in the early 21st century, and again, we have moved from stagnation to actual decline, in which the scale of production globally, the scale of production of energy and everything else is actually contracting. The human population is not reproducing itself. In Marxist terms, simple reproduction means that the human population has to at least reproduce itself on the same scale. This is a map of human fertility, and all the areas that are dark green or darker, there are fewer than 2 children per family, which means over the long run, the population is not reproducing itself. It's only in the most impoverished area, such as Africa and parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia, where the populations are almost entirely rural, that reproduction is still continuing. For the vast majority of the population, reproduction is going into decline. So what is happening? Well, what I consider state-financed capitalism, and we may all have different definitions, is the third stage of the US-led global capitalist system. It is the stage of capitalism in decline. The first stage was the post-war recovery, in which there was real growth as the United States wiped out competing capitalists and reconstructed the world economy from huge destruction during the previous generation. At the same time, however, it created a huge war economy, which diverted critical economic resources. Nonetheless, this was a period of real growth. The second stage, beginning in the early 1970s, we can get into why this happened, but there was a shift to, as Eric just mentioned, a growing financialization of the economy, which was led by the monopolization of oil and an imposition through an elevated oil price of something like $5 trillion a year on the working class. A transfer of 20% of working class income to the capitalists, a period of slowing growth, growing stagnation, underinvestment, which paved the way for the present crisis, including for the outbreak of the pandemic. Again, there was only a brief respite during the period of the Chinese integration. What we have now is a third stage of capitalism. What I call state-financed capitalism is the state has become the sole source of new investment. As the previous speakers have emphasized, of course, the state has always been involved in capitalism, for example, as an avenue for capitalist investment. But now the state has become the source of investment. So in the last decade of the pre-SFC epoch, most private investment went into the private sector, and very little government investment went into the private sector. In the transition that started to occur after the crash of 2008, private investment became almost half into the government sector because it was seen as the only safe sector. Government investment in the private sector increased to 15% of the total. A critical investment that was needed to prevent the total meltdown of the financial sector in 2008 and 2009. Today, with the pandemic, and more specifically with the onset of the crisis in March of last year, we have had a total shift so that now almost 88% of private investment is going into government bonds, seen as the only safe investment And government investment has taken over nearly 87% of the total investment in the private sector. How does this work? Well, again, focusing just on the United States, the other countries are very similar. The US Federal Reserve now is 100% of the source of corporate borrowing, corporate bonds. So if you look at the orange line, that's total corporate borrowing, trillions of dollars per year in the United States. The blue line is the lending to the corporate sector by the Federal Reserve. And we see, of course, in 2008, the government became the sole source of lending and remained almost the sole source with ups and downs through approximately 2015. At that point, the Fed felt it safe to stop buying corporate bonds and even for a couple of years sell back some of their holdings. So during that brief period of 4 years, private investment again was lending to companies. With the onset of the pandemic, and especially the crash during the end of March of 2020, again, the Fed became 100% of the lending to corporations. And although it dropped sharply, that lending is again rising to support the corporate bond market. Now, where does this money go? This is, again, Eric mentioned, this money is going 100% into stock buybacks. This is not going at all into the real economy. The blue line here represents total sales of stocks on the US stock market, which varies a lot. The red line is the average over 10-year periods. So there isn't a lot of shares being sold on net. But the yellow line, which starts back in the 1990s, is corporate buybacks, mergers and acquisitions, which, as you can see, began with private investment and is now entirely government investment in buybacks. This is the sole reason for the increase in price of shares. The amount of money in the stock market is not rising, but as buybacks continue, the number of shares available are shrinking. That, by the magic of the stock market, greatly increases the level of assets, which are overwhelmingly held by the very rich. So Senator Manchin said we don't want an entitlement society. The question is, who is entitled? Well, this is who is entitled. This is the increase in the wealth of the very wealthy in the United States. And you see at the end of this graph, a gigantic spike in which $25 trillion a year is being added to the wealth of the wealthiest 1/100th of 1% of the population. This is wealth generated purely by the investment of $1.5 trillion of federal money into the stock market through these corporate loans. This is what I call the biggest daylight heist in history. This is the same story in the EU, in Japan, in China. There is no conspiracy. This is the open, collective, coordinated action of the US-led capitalist class, backed by parties from the Republicans to the Chinese Communist Party. It amounts to a transfer of about 16% of median US household income. It's 5 times the amount of money being considered by the Biden administration. And just considering the billionaires, which are not the only recipients of this wealth, the average government subsidy per billionaire is approximately $4 billion per year. So this is the size of this enormous transfer of state investment. What is the impact on the working class? This is on top of petrocapitalism, on top of the warfare state. It doesn't substitute it for it. It supplements it and accelerates the transfer of wealth from workers to capitalists. How so? Well, obviously, we see already the calls for austerity. Gee, we've spent so much money on the billionaires, there's no money left for schools, hospitals, housing, or anything else. In addition, we are starting to see an effort to cut wages via inflation. Now, why, briefly, are we having inflation now and not in 2008? Well, there were real concessions that were considered politically essential during the pandemic. So there is real consumer demand, which has created, since goods were not produced during the shutdown, real shortages. That spills over some of the fake money, this fictitious capital, from financial assets into real assets, such as oil and real estate. On the other hand, there is also a real shortage of labor. So the attack on working class wages is turning into a labor upsurge. We'll discuss this more in future teach-ins. This is, again, a simple way of looking at it. This is real wages in the United States, which peaked way back in the 1970s. You see a big jump during the pandemic of about 7%, and now a definite retreat because workers, despite strikes, are not yet able to defend the level of wages achieved during the pandemic. But why is this happening now? We get into Luxembourg. Luxembourg's theory of accumulation demonstrated that capitalism requires an external market and an external source of wealth, the continuous transformation of peasants into proletarian, the seizure of peasant land, and a growing external market. That leads to an accelerating urbanization of the entire world, which is a self-limiting process, which has now reached its limits. Any process of urbanization, of proletarianization, must follow what scientists call a logistic curve, an S-shaped curve. We can see the example, for example, of South Korea, which underwent a complete urbanization during the last 50 years. Once 50% urbanization is reached, the process has to slow. On a worldwide level, that level of 50% was reached in 2007, not coincidentally at the start of the transition to state-financed capitalism and to the end of expanded reproduction. I can go into this more in the discussion. This is another way of showing that up until the 1990s, the rate of accumulation and the rate of urbanization were more or less the same, except for the big blip around 2000, which again was due to Chinese industrialization. Accumulation has been way above urbanization, which is tending towards negative levels due to the growth of fictitious capital. Is there a capitalist exit from this crisis? No. Investment in real production has become unprofitable. And therefore, any concessions, any increase in working class consumption leads to inflation, which threatens to erase capitalist profits and threatens capitalist fictitious capital. This leads to extreme instability in the economy, but means concessions will only be granted when capitalist power is threatened, and permanent concessions requires the removal of capitalist power. The solutions of the 1940s are impossible, as I think should be obvious. Under capitalism, a downward cycle, an ever decreasing standard of living is inevitable. On the other hand, and finally, state-financed capitalism focuses and politicizes the class war. Simply reversing the policy of state-financed capitalism, simply selling the trillions of bonds that the governments have accumulated would lead to the instant bankruptcy of all top financial companies. The government would inherit instantly ownership of 70% of the economy, liberating trillions of dollars needed for social investments. However, the key to that control over the economy is democratic control over finance, not just state ownership, as John pointed out. See the example of China. The earlier transformations of the capitalist economy must also be undone. The petroeconomy must be eliminated with the development of fusion energy, the only possible source of clean, cheap, and safe energy. And the massive real shortages of goods can only be reversed, addressing Eric van der Venter's problem, by ending the warfare economy, by redirecting the vast manufacturing power embodied in the defense sector and the aerospace sector worldwide to the production of real needs. So we'll be discussing much more of that in future teach-ins. I will end there. Thank you, and let the discussion begin.
Okay, thank you, Eric. All four presenters, excellent works. Again, this has been videotaped. There's transcripts that we're going to convert to publishable material. And we've already been contacted by a publisher who is interested in publishing the presentations, which I think is great news and very appropriate. So I already see a hand up. So do use the reaction button on the bottom, and I'll just put your hand up, and then I'll call on you. We're gonna take like three or four questions, and then have them go back to the presenters. So people try to keep it to about 2 minutes or so, but we've got some flexibility. So let's go to Carol Lang, my comrade from CUNY first.
Hey, Jay. I thought a lot of the presentations about the financialization were very interesting, and I'm looking forward to sort of hearing them again. But I have like a couple of issues. One of them is the idea that it's possible to defund and abolish the police without abolishing capitalism, even though maybe that implies the abolition. But as I forget who it was, maybe Eric or something, said that capitalism needs the police to maintain private property, so that the call for the defunding, I mean, at CUNY, we're asking to get rid of the cops, to take them off campus. And I think specifically in those circumstances, not only, the police harass the students, but there's $58 million that goes with the funding of the police at CUNY, I think is a completely reasonable argument. But I think it's utopian to say that you can get rid of the police or even defund the police without getting rid of capitalism. My second issue is, and I'll make this fast, is that nobody has talked about revolution here, about organizing the working class to overthrow capitalism. And maybe that will be later on. And I'm not going to be able to make it through the entire, because I have to leave in about an hour. But, this is all important, but we have to start talking about organizing the working class into a revolutionary party that can fundamentally redress the questions of not only inequity, but to transfer the means of production into the hands of the working class in order to be able to transform society. So, I would like, maybe that's later, and maybe if it is, I'm sorry, I won't be able to participate, but I think that has to be front and center in terms of developing any sort of revolutionary program to ultimately transform society. So those are my two comments.
Okay, thank you, Carol. We're going to take a few more questions. And just so you know, this is the first installment of a series. So some of those questions will be more focused in the subsequent sessions, but some of the speakers could probably address your question here as well. Roz, did you have your hand up earlier? I thought you did. Okay.
No, I was just applauding.
Oh,
I appreciated the talks very much, and I'm still thinking about what I might formulate as a question or questions. Thank you.
okay, that's fine. Thanks. It was an applause, not a hand to raise a question. That's fine. Steve, Lee?
Hi. Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for all the talks. Excellent. Lots of stuff to think about. So the question I have is, although I agree that the ruling class is united in some ways over this, over this strategy, what do you make of the current political divide? It seems like a section of the ruling class is more concerned about U.S. competitiveness, infrastructure, both physical and also social. So you have the Biden kind of Democratic wing pushing in this direction. You have the Republicans seemingly going along with old forms of neoliberalism, just, make money now. I don't care about investing in the U.S. and competing and that kind of stuff. So it seems to be there is a division in the ruling class over strategy, and how does that fit into the analysis that people have put forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Lauren, were you trying to raise your hand? Yeah, so your physical hand. Go ahead.
Come on, can you hear me?
Now we can. Go ahead.
Okay, well, a couple of things. Number one, I want to applaud everybody. It's very interesting. I have several questions, and whoever wants to try to answer them. Number one is sort of, I don't know how to exactly word the question, but I live in Chicago, as some of you people know, and once upon a time in the old days, there used to be a huge steel industry in the southern part of Gary in northern Indiana, which is all gone now, much like in Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, my first question is really this, that in back at such times as you had workers in steel companies and large automobile companies, which we still do have, it's sort of easier in a way to get workers to understand how they're getting screwed all day long, and you had organizations like unions, and workers would gather together on Friday afternoon after payday to spend some of their paychecks drinking and things like that. The question I have, having tried for years and years, is it's much harder to get a lot of people, including people in the middle classes, and I know that middle class is an ideological term, not a Marxist term, but people to understand the complexities of financialization in general, and especially something that I point out, I talk about a lot, is the derivatives market. It is very, very difficult for most people, unless they have some background, even in plain economics, to understand derivatives as the not even fictional psychedelic capital, because they're bets on what might happen 20 years from now in terms of the exchange rate between the renminbi and the franc or something like that. So I think one of the questions in terms of organizing is how we can get these concepts across. And I know it's very, very difficult. Some of you people, and Roz knows, Roz has a chapter in my book on Piketty. This is very, very complicated. And although anybody in this audience can at least grasp the essence of the presentations, this is much harder for the general population. Number two, and I put it on the chat list, I'm one of the founders of the Global Studies Association. Some of you have been there. It looks like we may have our next meeting finally in person at St. John's in New York next year. I put the website. And finally, my last question specifically to Eric, I didn't catch what was meant by fusion energy. Are we talking about the use of hydrogen fuels or what? So that's a lot to keep people busy.
Great. So we've had three questions, and the panelists, if you want to take a stab at, Eric had one specifically addressed to him, but they're relevant to several of the speakers.
Okay, well, I will just answer the fusion energy question, which has been addressed to me by a couple. All right. This is a very important concept. Fusion energy is the source of the sun's energy. It's actually the energy source that powers the universe. Without fusion energy, there's no life on Earth. Here on Earth, fusion, using the power of fusion energy is the way to solve the energy crisis. Fusion fuels, and the ones that are best are a combination of hydrogen and the element boron, are 1 million times more powerful than petroleum. So a single gram of fusion fuels gives the same energy as 1,000 tons, as a ton of petroleum. So I am a fusion researcher. That's what I do. That's my day job. And the fact is, this form of energy, which has been starved for research, could decrease energy costs by a factor of 10 or more and reduce the physical volume of fuel by a factor of 1 million. So it's inherently decentralized, it would be impossible to monopolize. And it would solve the question of how do we increase the energy supply without damaging the environment. It has, no radioactive waste, no carbon dioxide. The ultimate product of it is helium, which is a useful gas. It's essential that the governments of the world invest the money necessary to develop this energy source. And with sufficient energy investment, we are convinced, and by we, I not only mean myself, but many hundreds of researchers, that this could be developed and commercialized within this decade, within the 2020s. So fusion energy has got to be popularized, and it has to be a key element of a socialist program. And fusion energy, of course, would run the oil and gas companies out of business, which would destroy approximately $5 trillion in capitalist income. That's why they don't want fusion energy to be developed.
Jay, you're muted.
Jay, you're muted yourself.
Okay, sorry. Yes, so there was, Eric answered Lauren's one of his questions, but there were several others if others want to weigh in. Peter, I know, and Eric Van Venner had questions, and Sally directed to them.
Well, I'll just take the question.
Okay, Peter and then Eric Van Venner.
Yeah, just quickly on the question of defunding police. I don't know of anybody who has written extensively or even peripherally on the question of defunding. And I virtually know nobody in the campaigns I've been involved in since the summer of 2020 on defunding. Of course, they'll go back a decade before that, who actually thinks that police can be completely defunded or abolished within capitalism. I don't know anybody who thinks that. I mean, for Ruth, anybody from Angela Davis to Ruth Gilmore to dozens of other thinkers, I don't know anybody who thinks that. So I don't quite know why it's even an issue. But what is germane about the demand is, first of all, to have an immediate focus on something that is achievable, to transfer some of that wasted resources going into police and prison system and redirecting it for community needs, that is mental health facilities, et cetera, other forms of caring, et cetera, by cutting the police budgets and everything else. But defunding police is a process. It's not a slogan about one action. But it's certainly not an assumption that one action is going to end the police system and then all of a sudden we miraculously have a new world upon us without touching anything about capitalism. I frankly don't know of anybody who really thinks that. There may be some, but I haven't met many of them, and I've been pretty involved in the movement. So I think, look, you can call for worker control of production, right? You know very well, everybody here in this room knows that you're not going to get workers' control of production in capitalism. That doesn't mean you don't demand workers' control of production, because you say to workers, hey, listen, it's great that you fight for your higher wages and benefits, and you certainly need it, Joe's been doing this work for endless numbers of years with adjuncts and knows how they are discriminated against in terms of their benefits and wages. I was one myself for 9 years. But the point is that you try to involve yourself in that battle by saying, no, it's not just to fight for better wages and benefits. Ultimately, without you controlling the work process, you're not going to be free. Does that mean that there's an assumption here that you're going to have freely associated workers of control of production in a capitalist society? No, what you're planting seeds of consciousness is leading people to target the direct social relations of capitalism by guiding them in that direction. And I think there's a parallel here with the defunding the campaigns. The problem is that the media stereotypes and, really has, and for very, very good reason, they're very scared about that these demands for defunding. I mean, when you had something like Miriam Kaba, who's a longtime advocate of on the far left of advocating for police abolition and prison abolition, which he suddenly published in the summer of 2020 because we had the largest continuous mass protest in the history of the United States, right? 26 million people responded to that murder of George Floyd. And it wasn't just about George Floyd. In 2,500 rallies and marches across the country, that really was an amazing series of events that really has terrified not just the Republicans and not just the Democrats, a good section of the Black bourgeoisie as well, and a lot of other people who have a stake in the existing society. So of course they're going to stereotype the campaign as either being unrealistic because how can we do without police? That's one argument. And the other argument being, of course, which you get some parts of the left, it's unrealistic because after all, we can't get rid of the police until we get rid of capitalism. No, it's a question of what's the pathway to developing a movement against capitalism. And the struggle for having the kind of, this is emphasizing in my comments, to have the kind of redistribution that takes the discussion outside the framework of the welfare state, which is which is especially Eric's comments and others' comments, both Eric have emphasized, the welfare is not, you're not going to have a refurbished welfare state, given what's been happening with financialization. That is the real utopian demand, okay? So to narrow the focus of redistribution within refurbishing the existing welfare state, there's no future to that. And there's no, but there is a future and a promising revolutionary one. Yes, we need a revolution. How are we going to get to a revolution? We're going to get a revolution by people having revolutionary consciousness. And I'm convinced that campaigns like Defund have done a great deal to raise that consciousness.
Okay, Eric Vandevetter.
Yeah, excuse me. So let me respond to Steve's question, which remains. So I'm interested in the argument that the Democrats or the Biden administration might have an idea of improving U.S. competitiveness, but I'm not at all convinced that there's anything like that in their proposals, and I certainly don't think they intend to do it or they even intend to get these things passed if they did notionally want those things in their various infrastructure bills. There's been a lot of discussion over the years, often associated with the Democratic Party, of restoring U.S. competitiveness. Bill Clinton came into office, promising to restore U.S. competitiveness. The U.S., even the manufacturing sector of the U.S., is very competitive in some areas, as Eric mentioned, aerospace and weapons, medical technology, all kinds of things that we don't necessarily benefit from or don't benefit from to the fullest extent we could because we can't afford them. Those things still exist in the U.S. economy. Many of them support the Democratic Party. But I think what the Democrats have in their bill is a slight marginal, as Peter said, refurbishment of the welfare state, which maybe some of them would actually like to see adopted. It's not going to fundamentally change the political economy. I think you use the word, there's a section that supports the Republicans and a section that supports the Democrats, maybe a section of capitalists. I think there is a sectional divide between the Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats, there's a very pronounced spatial divide, regional divide on who votes for whom, largely a middle-class electorate. And I use that term because it reflects the interests of the kinds of people who are ultimately supporting these parties, which tend to be the property-owning, upper middle class, people who benefit from the enrichment of U.S. society, who benefit from financialization in many cases thus far. Not the majority of the U.S. population, but the preponderance of voters, in fact, and certainly the most influential people in both parties. And what divides the parties is not so much whether one of them is closer to the working class of this region or that region, but a sort of view about what to do about the crisis of profitability. And the premise of the Republicans right now is that they can't afford unionized workers. The US economy can't afford social benefits. It can't afford these things that keep the relatively high, comparatively, I don't know if the standards of living are actually higher, but the services that many democratic regions, cities that is, depend on. Whereas the Democrats think they can stay the course. I'm not even sure that capitalists are too firmly divided based on which party they would tend to support. They are playing these two off of each other, but I don't think either of them has any intention to really change the nature of the economy or change the role of US in international competition. Referring a little bit to the end of Eric's presentation, I think the US economy needs to be changed in any number of ways. It needs to be very thoroughly it needs to experience reconstruction, it needs to be rebuilt from the ground up in many ways, because what it is doing is not constructive to human existence or general existence on this planet. It should be directed towards redistribution of resources at a much higher level than what we're envisioning, and even reparations, international transfers within the society and so forth. That is revolutionary. It cannot be accomplished any other way. So much so that I don't even know that simply having a better energy source, which I certainly would hope for, fusion, is certainly not sufficient. I think many of these areas of reconstruction would have to happen regardless, with whatever forms of energy we can do. Certainly we ought to be and need to be shutting down, the new fracking and fossil fuel extraction and so forth. But I don't see that happening through any sort of gradual process, let us say. So I'll stop there.
Sally, do you have anything to respond?
No, they are American questions, so I cannot respond to any of that.
Oh, okay, great. And Eric, did you responded to the question about energy, but did you want to respond to any of the other ones, or we'll move on to the next round of questions?
No, let's move on to allow more questions.
Okay, great. So Sandra Rain, could you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much. This has just been excellent. And Peter started actually in his answer on the movement of defunding the police to venture into the area I'm interested in pursuing. And Sally, this does apply to you. One of the things that I think is important is, yes, we see the consciousness raising element of defund the police, but there's obviously a very concrete and material element to that, given the intersection in the United States between the prison system and, say, military equipment production and distribution. So it makes me think of Rosa Luxemburg's discussion of militarism as sort of this way out that the capitalist state likes to employ. And I'm curious, Sally, because I'm guessing there's probably not a similar social movement in Vietnam around, say, defunding the police, but could we see an emergent anti-militarism movement that might appeal in places outside of the United States? The second, I just want to say to Eric Lerner that I don't know if you're aware, but I am reaching you from the petro capital of North America in Alberta. And somewhere when you said fusion, there was a whole bunch of people that gasped, but it is an interesting question to think about how energy ties to revolutions. I studied with a mining historian who always used to say, every revolution is ultimately an energy revolution, and it's fundamental. And I think it's under-discussed in the movement. So I want to thank you for putting it front and forward in these discussions.
Thank you, Sandra. And I know Eric Lerner will have a response about that around revolution and energy. Len Mel. Len, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
I hope I did. Can you hear me? No.
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, because the symbol hasn't changed. Well, listening to this very intelligent discussion, I'm partly reminded of a comment I made many years ago at Bertel Ullman's seminar, where I said there are two definitions of alienation, and in Hegel, it's alienation from God, and today. It's alienation from domination. And I think ironically, what we're seeing, and I think Eric's 100% correct in the people presenting this, that we are in financialization, a domination by financialization. But I think in recognizing it and understanding it may be a very fleeting moment, because we have basically lost the whole battle of really talking about the power of ideas or consciousness, which is really central to the whole Marxist project in terms of liberation. And I think it's going to be very hard to convince people to solely focus on finance. And when we have so many issues related to domination, and not that they aren't important, but the solution might lie more, a creative expansion of ideas. And so on a cultural level, we have lost the battle, because there isn't anything really talking about that the great leap in human experience has been a leap of conceptualization. And it's the only thing that has made our progress possible, but yet it's totally under-conceptualized. And then of course, financialization is really about conceptualization, rarefied and misunderstood. So I hope I've been clear in the 2 minutes, but I'm saying that a much larger project is necessary, and that is about the power of ideas, and that human identity is located in our cognitive ability, and our liberation is similarly located there. And as a cultural situation, we've lost that battle, and we must think about how we could raise it and make it as vital as everything else we talk about.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, Mel. Len, excuse me. Our next speaker is Joe Barry.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for organizing this and this very high-level discussion under the auspices of Rosa Luxemburg, who is finally getting something resembling, in her thought, what she deserves out of history, and that's to be greatly honored, although not deified. I hope that the word Luxemburgist falls out of the vocabulary, and I would even be in favor of getting rid of Marxist, I think, and talk about people who practice dialectical and historical materialism. Anyway, thank you very much. I want to do two things in this comment. Well, one's a question. I want to support Peter's point about the defunding of the police, and I would add the rest of the criminal justice system, much of the civil justice system, and the military, which it's become so linked to that it's hard to distinguish where one ends and the next begins. I think that his argument about the political impact of that and where it sits on the spectrum of demands to be made is exactly right. And I wanted to say that. The second thing I wanted to say was express a disagreement with some of the assumptions of some of the speakers that people talk about the Democrats. And every time I hear people say that, I cringe. It's one of my main differences with people who come out of a Trotskyist history. I'll out myself and say I come out of a Maoist history myself, personally. But I think to generalize in that way, in the way that is often done, is to give both of the Democratic and the Republican Party, frankly, more of a certain kind of existence than they really have. Because I am convinced that, in a European or much of the rest of the world context, these electoral groupings are not really parties in the sense that was discussed historically in the socialist and communist movements. And confusion about that, I think, is a problem. And I think the snide comments toward the advances that have been made by people who are pursuing an inside-outside strategy toward the Democrats, and which includes trying to getting some people elected on the Democratic line. I think, you know, the snide comments about AOC and the squad are completely out of place and only serve to marginalize those of us who consider ourselves, you know, real socialists. And I think that the necessity to grapple with how to, and I'm glad the conversation has moved in this direction some, the necessity to grapple with how to make some of these ideas that people are discussing, what they mean, what some of these theories mean when run through the meat grinder of praxis, is where this discussion, you know, in subsequent iterations and in other parts of our work should be going. And you know, and that's what, you know, Helen and I tried to do in our book with regard to one tiny fraction of the mass movement, which is the you know, the not so tiny
Okay.
of contingent faculty.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Excuse me, Joe. We definitely, and we have one more questioner, and then we're going to go back to the panelists. Jace.
Hi, I just wanted to thank everybody for their presentation. I really appreciate it. Some of my questions involve, like, how do we get people on, like, the ground to really see how a value investment economy would work compared to a capitalist, like, financialized economy? Especially when, you know, in my heart of hearts, I love people, but it's very hard for people to imagine what these things would look like without, you know, to imagine an economy different than what they're used to. And in that sense, also, how does one ensure that if we do somehow make these changes and processes, how does one ensure the transition doesn't regress or go back into what it is and what it was, to secure those kinds of changes and a more personalized to America sort of thing, with all the aspects that need to be addressed and reconstructed in order to even sustain Earth, let alone like human and American life. And all of that sort of, how does one manage revolution as peacefully as possible? Is there really no way to avoid violence with how we've been and how we continue to be, while also acknowledging that our history is one of violence?
Okay, thank you, Jay. So maybe we start with Sally. You had a question directed toward you, and then we can go back to the other panelists.
Yep, sorry. The questions from Sandra, right?
I believe, is she still with us? I thought she had a question directed toward you. Yeah, Sandra had I thought, question towards you. But we can come back to you if you want, whatever you want to do.
So I think that Sandra asked me about the movement outside the US about defunding the police, right? So here or even China, we cannot do that. Unfortunately, we're gonna be sent to prison if we do that. But one of the things that I want to inform is that everybody have their own ideologies on hating the police already because of how they are oppressors and how they are suppressors. So I believe that maybe in the near futures, when the worker have all of their courage to go on a big strike or to go on a small protest, then another movement will come out. So right now, the military and the police are taking all of the powers, very dangerous, especially in this COVID pandemic period. everyone had to stay home, and the police are the ones who will surveillance outside. And if anybody go out, then they will punish that person with money. So yeah, they're taking big power. And if you're not wearing a mask here or even in China, you're gonna get punished too. And if you refuse to wear that, you're gonna be put to prisons. So that's so I'm just telling the situation here and in China.
Thank you, Sally. Let's go to Eric Van de Venner. We're going to reverse order from last time. Eric, you're muted. Eric Van de Venner.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So I think actually last round, Lauren made a point about derivatives, which I might have responded to and I don't think was really addressed. Yeah, it's difficult even to find things to recommend in the discussions on financialization because most of them are frankly wrong. The best book though I would recommend if anyone is interested is by Francois Chesnay, came out in 2016. I think it's called Finance Capital Today. And he's written in French before, but this is the first thing and it's very systematic. So anything you'd like to know, that would be a great place to start if you could. And obviously I think all kinds of educational initiatives should be tried among the workers on these issues. Let's see. Let me respond to Joe Barry's point about the Democrats, which I think was partly directed to me. Yes, I'm inclined to make snide comments about the Democrats as a unit. And respectfully, I think that we should think of them as the Democrats. I think the Democrats are in fact a much more coherent and organized instrument of capital, a formation of capitalist politics than is generally recognized. And it would be a very long discussion to have at some point. There were, ideas floated in the pages of Jacobin or in the DSA about the Democrats being a permeable organization. It was not organized along the lines of a political party with a specific agenda or so, things like that. And my view is that it's a very coherent entity, that it has an internal process, it has systems, it has means by which power is maintained in the way that it is maintained. And so we should be very conscious of identifying it and responding to it as such in the same way that we would for the Republican Party. But maybe we can talk about that more at some point. Let's see, Jace made a point about a different kind of economy, which I think is a very well taken kind of issue to talk about. And I've only, just begun to think about some of those things. So I'd be very interested in having a further conversation about what kind of economy would actually be desirable. I think it would start with production for use and more concrete. I mean, obviously we've read things like the Critique of the Gotha Program and other ideas about what, socialism or something past that might look like, but we should be a bit realistic and think about what actually we would like to do with the capitalist resources that have been produced and how we would change them and transform them into something we could actually sustainably live with. And finally, I just wanted to quick point, I think on Len Mell's issue about domination. I think it's a point that's very well taken. I think we're now, especially workers, but as human beings, we are more managed than we've ever been in history before. And we're technologically managed and surveilled. And there's a huge portion of the workforce whose job it is to manage others and to direct their activities and scrutinize them at a very detailed level. Obviously, Amazon is an example of this. And most of it goes towards the benefit of capital, obviously, and capturing more value from every piece of work. And it's extremely destructive to people's, health and well-being, among other things. And I think it is something that people recognize very strongly, that they react to the degree to which various parts, not so much the capitalists themselves, but the employees of the capitalists are engaged in managing them and controlling them. And some of this turns, unfortunately, into kind of reactionary resentment against those quote unquote elites. But I think it is something we should deal with, more fully. The degree to which a society that insists upon managing everything that people do and often, controlling their work in ways that are either unsafe or frankly just silly and useless and pointless to do. Alienates people's own mental abilities and their own creative abilities to decide how to work. And we need to have a system of work where people actually choose what is the best way to do what they want to do. That's what we should look for. So.
Okay, Peter, did you want to weigh in? You're muted.
Yeah, just 3 points. 2 of them in response to questions directly, and one, if I may, a response to my fellow panelists. First, I just want to say, Len's point about the battle of ideas. I'm not convinced we've lost the battle of ideas. We have to make sure we don't. Most of all, we're living in a climate, and this has been certainly before Trump, but Trump has greatly accelerated it, in which there is an attack, systematic attack on the idea of even trying to get to the truth, in which opinion matters over above all. And it just coincides with this, with the economic imperatives of this period of capitalism, in which the system itself has lost faith in its productive potential. And so basically the capitalists now are saying, let me get in there and get as much out while I can in terms of the cash and not worry about anything else. Well, that coincides with the notion, why do we need to worry about the truth or determining right from wrong or having any standard of judgment of whose position is correct and whose is not? So we have to resist that type of tendency with all our might, and we have to be aware of doing so because, frankly, it's not just coming from the right, but a kind of relativism that has also been predominant for many years on the left. I mean, what is postmodernism, post-structuralism, if not the effort to take down any quest for a determinative truth or demonstrative knowledge? And I think that directly relates to the concerns that we all have here. How do we, which I think Jay articulated very well, how do we how do we articulate an alternative to capitalism? We can't articulate an alternative to capitalism unless we're able to discuss a vibrant debate on ideas within the left and resurrect questions like the pursuit of truth very directly. That's one reason I wrote a book on Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism, to focus on what specific concepts take us beyond the very narrow way socialism has been understood, unfortunately, in much of Marxism after Marx. Second point I just want to raise very quickly is that, look, it's the first time in American history we have a political party taken over essentially by neo-fascism, and that's called the Republican Party now. And if January 6th had succeeded, or something like that succeeds in the near future, was such as by Trump getting democratically elected the next time around, what a horrible thought. I'm not so sure we'd be having these kind of discussions. We'd be a lot more like Vietnam than we are the United States right now. And that we have to nod to Sally for her courage in having these kind of discussions itself. So my point here is that, look, people are all kinds of young people are flooding in to vote for the progressive Democrats. And even when you look at Biden and the corporate Democrats, at least a space is provided for the kind of discussion that we need in order to advance an anti-capitalist alternative. Not that we depend on the corporate Democrats of Biden for that, not that we write a blank check to the progressive Democrats either, but there are severe differences and differentiations that we can take advantage of for the purposes of advancing the socialist cause, and that's already, of course, been happening for a couple of years now. I just want to end on one point. It's more of a question to Eric on the question of, fascinating question you raised about the urbanization passing and peasantry, that urbanization now around the world several years ago surpassed 50%. I'm a little puzzled, however, in light of your discussion of that, why you think expanded reproduction has actually come to an end. Because there is still 48% of the world that is peasant or non-urban, okay? That's a huge resource for capital to exploit and to utilize, of course, in an unproductive direction through primarily financialization. But it seems that that pool of available labor power that Luxemburg focused so much upon the accumulation of capital, I mean, China has a ton of it left, right? And now we're not even touching India or Africa. So I'm a little puzzled at why on that grounds you can support the claim of expanded reproduction being impossible, unless you're proceeding from her assumption that you can't have capital accumulation unless you have non-capitalist societies still in existence. And of course, we don't have that anymore. Frankly, I don't think we've had that for decades. But I think that's the weakest part of her theory of accumulation. And that's why I think, frankly, the part of Marx that she dismissed the most and most directly in her response to Nachemson, the Bundist, who wrote a review of the accumulation of capital, saying that, well, Luxemburg leaves out the concept of the decline in rate of profit, and she dismisses that in a few sentences in the anti-critique, is actually the real pertinent thing for us to look at, because as all the panelists suggested, I think that's the seminal issue of this moment we're living in, the endemic
Thank you.
profit rates.
Thank you, Peter, for sharpening the theoretical discussion, and then we'll end up here with Eric Lerner.
Okay, well, quite a few questions directed at me. So I want to start with some advertising, and we'll redirect some of these questions to other resources. First of all, I really do want people on this discussion to visit LPP Fusion, which is our tiny research company. And on the homepage are videos that describe some of the relationship between energy, the current crisis, and Sandra's question of, and other people's question of where society could go. What sort of society could we have if, in the videos, it describes if we change energy. Here, we'll say it if we describe energy and achieve a socialist society. I mean, Marx famously said, given a windmill, you have a feudal lord. Given a steam mill, you have a capitalist. I would continue saying, given a fusion energy generator, you have socialism. One can't exist without the other. So please, people, do look at those videos and send comments back to me about them. We are having the next teach-in in December about the ideological questions that have arisen in the past few years. So we are going to be discussing that at length. And the third, also in December, is going to be the question of what does socialism look like and how do we get there? And finally, although I've only discussed it so far with Jay, I certainly think it would be a good idea to have a fourth teach-in specifically on the question of electoral politics, mass movements, and the relation to existing parties. So just in terms of that, let me take on Peter's question, which I think is easiest to answer. What Luxemburg's books emphasized was that in Marx, there is an idea that capitalism must rest on the expansion of profit, on the expansion of capital. In today's world, we see this in the financial pages every day. What investors are interested in a specific company is its profits growing or likely to grow? If you have a possibility of growing profit, then you invest money, it is then worth more because it generates more profit. If you invest money and the profit you get is the same or less, you have lost your investment, and in fact, your investment is worthless. So that is the problem with the accumulation of capitalism in a period after urbanization has passed 50%. You are going to have a slowing amount for every, there is basically a relationship between every peasant turned into a proletarian, every acre of peasant land turned into a new development, and the quantity of profit. And if you pass that 50%, you are going to have a slowing of that process so that there will be less profit and less profit produced each year. In addition, there are structural barriers that will introduce that slowing more rapidly. India is not China. It is impossible for India, with its a completely gutted public sector, its completely destroyed infrastructure, to duplicate what China has done, because the Chinese Communist Party, looking at the bad example of Russia, said, we will preserve the state sector, make an alliance with the foreign capitalists, and use that to enormously, rapidly industrialize our economy. And that's what they did. That's impossible in India. It's completely out of the question. Second of all, if you look at China itself, I didn't have time to use this slide, so I'll just summarize it. Because of years of underinvestment in the youngest part of their population and the suppression of the birth rate, the Chinese workforce is going to decline by 1% a year for the next 20 years. We know that because all of those people are born. The number of women of childbearing age is going to be declining 2% per year for the next 20 years. Again, they are all born. So the production capacity in China, for example, auto production peaked in 2017, well before the pandemic. So there are many pieces of evidence that show that basically this logistic curve, where you have a rising, almost exponential curve up to 50%, and then a declining curve beyond 50%, means that the quantity of profit is going to decline. And as the quantity of profit declines, expanded reproduction becomes impossible. And instead, you are going to have an acceleration of profit being maintained only by decreasing the standard of living of the entire global population, which decreases the scale of production, which leads to smaller profit, which means to more decreases. This is a formula for a dark age. And this is the capitalist program that we must pose an alternative to. And to answer Sandra, that's basically what we're talking about. We have to create a vision. I hope these videos are a first step of what an urbanized, prosperous global society could look like with the technologies we have available. A reduction in, one of the things we can do is resume a reduction in the hours of work. The hours of work were dropping very rapidly in the United States up until the 1940s. Since the 1940s, they have increased. We can talk about what a society looks like when people are working 25 hours a week, but are having a higher standard of living, a higher level of education, a far lesser impact on the environment. That's the sort of vision I think that socialists can create.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Before we go to our next questioners, I just want to amplify a little bit about what Eric said about the subsequent teach-ins that we're going to have that will address in a much deeper way some of the questions that have arisen. So our next one in early December will be addressing what is fascism, what is freedom, and we're going to be having Marcy Smith, who's done some great work critiquing the role of the CIA-backed Gene Sharp and his negative role on the left in the United States and globally. And then Eric will also be participating, and then we're going to have Jeremiah Morlock, who was also here briefly as part of this presentation. And then we're going to have a subsequent one on what is socialism, which will be getting into what is the political practice that we need to be mounting in the face of the current stage of capitalism that we face. And again, we want to emphasize this is not about a talk shop, and obviously we have some differences. And as two of my students that are here, Aloysius and Christian, I don't know if you're still here, but we talk about within our movements, there are fields of argument, and that's clearly played out, but we can come to some agreements on some common actions that we can begin undertaking. And that's one of the goals of this series that we're mounting. And we hope that you, the participants here, will help us organize the subsequent ones. So I believe we have, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, we have emails for everyone that's registered here. So you'll be getting an invite to help organize the subsequent sessions that we're going to be holding. Okay.
Oh, I would like to add, just on a technical issue, that anyone who does not want to share their email with anyone else, please mention that in the chat. Otherwise, we will be sending out an email to all participants that will include all of your emails. So anybody here can chat with anybody else. So if you want to opt out, do so in the chat. Otherwise, you will be included, and so will actually the other registrants, even those who didn't participate.
Okay, so Aloysius, if you did want to ask, you don't have to, but if you wanted to, you're very welcome to. But we just have one question from Harry. Is there anyone else? Raise your hand. Roz, if you were going to ask. We see it, my comrade Mike Howells from New Orleans is here. So if you guys do have some questions, raise your hand on this round if you can. Harry Kaysen, another one of my colleagues from College of Staten Island. Staten Island is in the house. And we also had, just so you know, one of my former students works at the Staten Island warehouse, and she's part of the union organizing campaign, but she had to leave. Go ahead, Harry.
Thanks, Jay and Eric and everyone involved in organizing this. It's very, very well done. All I want to say, though, is that this kind of thing is really for us. It's for the left. It's for socialists. It's for Marxists. It's for people, for Maoists. It's for people who are actively involved in the left and really hoping to. And I'm shocked. I am absolutely bowled over that you said that we're going to have a discussion about what is socialism. That's just incredible. I think that's wonderful, wonderful idea. I just want to add or to say that this is, as I said, this is for us, but it really, the average American would have a hard time sticking with the discussion. I'm looking forward to playing and Jay, I hope you'll send out the place where we can watch everything again, because it's the second time, the third time you read a book that you really really get what's going on. And so I really want to go back through what's been said here today. But I have kind of boiled down my approach to what is socialism, or how would we reach the American public in this effort that you're doing here today. And I just boil it down to real simple, non-high-tech Marxist lingo or anything: competition versus cooperation. What would the world be like if we lived in a cooperative world? And Eric just pulled, well, he actually put up another column for me, learner, Eric. This is one of the first things that comes out when we discuss what another world would be like if a cooperative world would be like if we were to build that kind of world. And that is, we could probably take some time off. We could probably work things, be more productive. So that's all I had to say. I think we have to be real simple with the American public, and then let the discussion get deep. And it does. I do this with my students all the time, and we have great discussions. Great discussions. What would a cooperative society look like? And they're the ones who come up with all kinds of socialist solutions. So that's it.
Okay, thank you, Harry. Is there anyone else? Any other questioners? I do want to call out Deepika, who's here with us, who also will be one of our presenters at the last session on, well, maybe penultimate session on what is socialism. Avron, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a question because in the real life of being with workers, or the people in particular that I work with, there's an overemphasis, shall we say, from propaganda on the people that get like 1.5% of the budget. In other words, people that get benefits that are from the working class. So they're demonizing those people. These are fellow workers. But the people that are next door to you, who are the billionaires, are not next door to you. That's the problem. So how do you raise consciousness of workers? Because we look at Rosa Luxemburg, and there was a mass movement that was supporting them. We don't have them. I think some of it was brought up. I think that was a great about the anti-police, about defunding the police was one key answer. So if anybody has any ideas about that, more insights, that would be helpful. I know it's a big topic.
You're breaking up a little bit. Did people get that question? You did. Okay. All right. I have, as a moderator, I'd like to ask a question for Eric Van de Venner. I really do hope this dissertation becomes a book. You laid out that fascinating kind of fork in the road for the U.S. ruling class in the 70s, whether they were going to reinvest to be able to compete with Japan and Western Europe, West Germany at the time. And as you said, they took the financialization route. And it seems a lot of parallels with the Latin American ruling class around ISI, that they were facing a crisis as well. They had to deepen that process, go to the producer goods section, which would have required more state intervention and a redistribution of wealth to expand the economy. And they abandoned it, not because it was exhausted, but politically. It wasn't economically, but politically exhausted. I was wondering if that's kind of the argument that you're making. I don't know if it's implicit there, that they went the financialization route because the other route politically would have been dicey, with the challenges that might have generated, deeper challenges from the working class. And the financialization route was a way to deal the working class a blow.
Should I respond now, or do you want to do a round?
Well, you don't have to privilege. Yeah, I guess I have that privilege. Yeah, answer my question first, and then we'll go to the other questions. Since you're fresh in your mind, it's easier to address, and then we'll go to the other speakers.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Of course, there were states that tried something like ISI, and then further, did further industrial investment, for example, South Korea, and then had a huge labor movement, right? And then participated at least in the next kind of round of capitalist development. This is sometimes taken up on sort of the social democratic left to say that had the parties of sort of the labor parties of Europe been a little bit more coherent, they could have found situations within the world economy that would have allowed them to continue to have industrial development in a way that also would have, kept labor markets tight, given workers a lot of power, maybe had wage earner funds and so forth. Taking capital away from the capitalists through the state's ownership of it. And I just don't think it would have happened for the U.S. I think that you can see isolated cases where these states will succeed in continuing with this capitalist development. But for an economy as large as the U.S., that opportunity would run very quickly into the falling rate of profit. And I don't think that they were at all interested, right, in tackling that problem as the U.S. And I think this actually characterizes the ruling classes of a lot of countries. I'm a little bit more familiar with Africa than Latin America, but ruling classes which have decided to unite their fortunes to the U.S. financial markets and transfer their wealth to these places and try to, and sometimes leave on their own, but try to make their profits that way rather than by developing whatever's going on in various countries around the world. I think the question you posed also is kind of relevant for China at this point. Will China engage in another sort of intense round of capitalist investment and further, sort of test the waters of what can be done with more development, or will the government and the capitalists turn more towards financial options, which many indications suggest it may be happening. I take a little bit of a slight difference with Eric Lerner's presentation of the issue of continued development. I think it is quite possible that although the rates of profit would be lower, the capitalists in India or in Africa or in other countries would try to continue and approach stagnation and sort of run into all the political problems and much more acutely even the ecological problems that we'd face. I think the financial system can produce enough sort of debt that capital circulation can continue. And this is a bit more of a technical issue concerning Luxemburg's argument. But I think that that might very well happen, except that we will face political crises and ecological crises that will prevent that from being the actual outcome. If that makes sense.
Well, just responding to Eric, I mean, you know, in discussing the historical situation back in the 70s, on the one hand, you keep using the word decide, which implies that there was a decision to be made. But when you actually get into the concrete logic, it doesn't seem like there was any decision to be made. The decision was, were they going to do something that would allow them to continue to make profits and to accumulate capital, or were they going to do something that wasn't? And in that case, it really wasn't a decision. And I certainly don't think they had decision of how they were going to implement this politically. And they did have a process in which they decided on this whole petro-capitalism option, which you know took a lot of planning and CIA thinking and think tank thinking and so on. But it seems to me that they didn't really have a choice, that they could continue investing in the real economy, because the concessions that they made in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when they had a fear, perhaps even unjustified, but a fear of a radical movement, had already put them into a very serious situation where they were not making money, they were losing money hand over fist, and they had to get out of that, and they had to get out of it very quickly. So really, putting aside, 2021, in 1974 or thereabout, was there a real decision on their hands, or were they pretty much forced to do what they ended up doing?
Yeah, if I may, I'm very close to agreeing with what you just said about that. It's a certain imprecision of the way I speak about this that I say the capitalists decided. Obviously, a class in an aggregate can't make a decision in the same way that individual capitalists, who did make these decisions, individual capitalists, right, in aggregate, that added up to a collective action, right? And state planners, right, people in government offices did also make decisions which contributed to this. And I don't think that the alternative scenario was all that, promising. It wasn't likely to happen. It maybe couldn't have happened because capitalists wouldn't have gone along with it. But it is the case that from the 60s into the 70s, the capitalists were making a certain level of investments. And that is part of why there was high rate of inflation and relatively tight labor markets. And that potentially could have continued in a different way into the 80s. I'm not saying how that might have happened as a counterfactual, but a different choice, in a certain sense, a choice was made to focus, the accumulation of capital in a different way. And the state was brought in to take up that cause and do what was necessary, and very effectively in quite a few countries, in fact. So. Okay, you're muted.
And so Harry and Avron had a couple questions. I don't know if any of our panelists can address them.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in on one of them.
Okay.
Just on one of them about just before you had spoken, Jay, the question about raising consciousness of the working class and the role that that plays in this juncture. There's something quite remarkable that's been happening. It's happening right in front of our eyes. It's historically unprecedented as far as I can tell. Tens of millions of workers, certainly in the United States, but it's also happening in other parts of the world, are voluntarily leaving the workforce or putting off returning to work. Why? Because the experience of the pandemic has taught them, well, the fragility of life. You never know now. It reminds you of your finite existence, that we only have so much time. Who knows when, who's going to die when? We always kind of know that, but it certainly brings it front and center. But also, more importantly, having that distance from the workplace or what have you, and then returning later in at the latest, more recent stages of the pandemic, amplifies in people's minds, like, why am I wasting so much of my time engaged in these lengthy hours of labor that are being treated very miserably and everything else? So we're talking about like 14 million people possibly in the last 2 years that have basically exited themselves voluntarily from the labor force, and millions are actually saying right now, I want to reorientate my life to have more time with friends, more time with family, even if it means a lower standard of living or whatnot. I want to reorganize my time in a way that was not, people not experiencing earlier. This is an extraordinary development with deep philosophical as well as political and economic ramifications. So why do I say that? What's the basis of value production? We didn't really get much into that today. It's one thing to say we shouldn't just have distribution of value, but try to get away from a system that is governed by value production. But what does that really mean? It all centers on the question of time, right? In other words, the domination of a certain modality of time, socially necessary labor time, that we're forced to produce according to an abstract average, produce so much in so much time established by the world market over which we have no control, right? Time is really central to the constitution of value, right? A certain modality of abstract universal labor time, right? This rigid, mechanical, routinized conception of time that we're forced to live with. Or as Marx beautifully puts it early in his writings, early writings, he says, we do no longer, in capitalism, we no longer control time. Time now controls us. So when people are doing what they're doing as in a response to the pandemic, they're battling this very central phenomenon of the capitalist organization of time, which is implicitly an anti-capitalist move. Whether they're aware of it or not, that's what it is. So much of our discussions on the left is too much often in the form of, okay, we are the theoreticians. How are we going to bring our theory to the masses, to the practice? Far less often is there the emphasis on we, the theoreticians, should be listening to to the theory embedded in the practice of the masses, okay? The movements from practice are themselves forms of theory. Or as Marx put it in a beautiful expression once, he said, it's not enough for theory to strive towards realization. It's also necessary for reality to strive towards thought, okay? So there's kind of an imminent movement in response to the pandemic of rethinking the whole nature of work and time determinations among millions of people worldwide. And we have to help supply the words to express what they're saying, because I think if we do that, we are giving a really profound redefinition of socialism that would be adequate for our time.
Okay, Sally or Eric want to wrap this up? Do you have anything to say?
Well, I absolutely agree with the last remark. I mean, obviously, we, socialist theorists of a century ago and more felt that the demand for a shorter work day, a shorter work week, was absolutely essential to the organization of the socialist movement, for the simple reason that people just didn't have time to do activism when they were worked to exhaustion. And clearly, in the past generation in this country, we have had a destruction of the 40-hour week. And, we obviously have far less time. All of us know that we've talked to people who have said, I'd love to do it, but family obligations and so on preclude. The fact that the pandemic enforced a massive reduction in the hours of work allowed people to give some time to thinking, which some of them, as Peter says, are still taking advantage of. Yeah, this is an enormous opportunity for us to make use of that time to see whether we can't you know, organize that enormous mass of people who are saying, well, what am I doing with my life? Where is the society going? I certainly know personally people who pre-pandemic found themselves on unemployment for a certain length of time, were able to support themselves without working, and underwent total personal transformation, including political transformations. So yeah, I agree. I think that this is an enormous opportunity. I hope that events like this one and the ones that we plan and putting these on video, getting them into much greater circulation, are going to be a step to take advantage of this gift of time that is perhaps the silver lining of what is otherwise a tremendous catastrophe. So yeah, let's absolutely take that forward.
Sally, any last words from Ho Chi Minh City for us?
Yeah, I just want to add in a little bit. I definitely agree with Peter and Eric on raising consciousness for the workers. But I want to add one more thing, that I think that the worker already have their own consciousness because of what they have been through, from the factory to their housework, the domestic works, they have consciousness already. But the thing is that, what is the solutions? What is the solution to solve all of the conflicts, or to solve all of the things that they always think that there's no way to solve it? So I think that like Rosa Luxemburg, she talked about a party, and the party is the place where everything is order and organizes the worker. So yeah, I just want to add one more thing. That's it.
All right. Well, I think we'll close it out there. Again, we want to thank our speakers, and these will, it's been recorded, and we will, as Harry brought up, we will have these made available. Also, we're looking to get the presentations published, and we've just been, I checked my email, we've been contacted by a journal that's interested in publishing these very important materials. And I agree with Harry that we need to really study these deep study of the incredible presentations. We need to be armed with theory entering into the turbulent times we are in already. So,
one last request is that if people have suggestions on the best places, channels to post this as a video, because we know that some channels get enormously more traffic than others. So if people have places where they think that they would accept this as a posted video on their channel, and that their channel would get a lot of traffic, please let us know, because we do want as many people as possible to see these videos. Thanks.